A wealthy businessman caught sight of his cook teaching his son how to dance. But when he uncovered the real reason behind it, a chill ran down his spine. Julian Lombardi was not a man who concerned himself with trivial matters. His life was built on precision. His business, his home, his daily routine. Everything followed a strict order, leaving no room for unexpected surprises. That's why, as he strode down the hallway toward his office, what he saw through the large glass window completely threw him off balance. His son was dancing, but he wasn't alone. The cook was with him. The sight was so unusual that Julian had to blink a few times, making sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. Leonardo, his 12-year-old son, was trying to mimic the woman's movements. Clumsily, yes, but with an intensity he hadn't displayed in years. His steps were uncertain, his posture awkward. But there was something about him, something Julian hadn't seen in a long time. A smile. The cook, a woman with dark hair tied back in a neat braid, her uniform crisp and spotless, moved effortlessly across the grass. This wasn't some random game, it wasn't a fleeting joke. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every motion was deliberate, graceful, filled with an unmistakable sense of expertise. She wasn't just someone who danced for fun. She moved like someone who had lived and breathed dance her entire life. Julian's brows furrowed. None of this added up. Leonardo had never once expressed an interest in dancing. He had always been a quiet, serious kid, more at home with books and technology than with anything remotely physical. So why was he doing this now? And why with her? Julian remained in the shadows of the hallway, watching in silence. The cook gently took Leonardo's hands, guiding him with practiced ease. The boy furrowed his brow, focused, and attempted to follow her lead. He stumbled, but instead of getting frustrated, he laughed. Julian felt a tightness in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen his son laugh so freely. Ever since his mother passed, Leonardo had seemed withdrawn, lost in his own world, always carrying a quiet sadness in his eyes. But now he looked like a kid again, and it was because of her. A shiver ran down Julian's spine. He didn't like the idea of someone else having that kind of influence on his son, especially not a cook. An unexplainable irritation grew inside him. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing, so he stepped into the yard. The sharp click of his shoes echoed against the stone path. Immediately, Leonardo and the cook froze. The boy lowered his head, as if he had been caught doing something wrong. The cook straightened up, not with fear, but with a quiet, cautious look in her eyes. Julian studied her. He barely knew her. He knew her name, Isabella, knew she had been working in the house for 6 months, knew she did her job well and never caused any trouble, but he had never seen her like this before. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cold. Isabella wiped her hands on her apron. "We were just practicing, sir." Julian turned to his son. "Since when are you interested in dancing?" Leonardo lowered his head. "For a while now." A sharp pang of guilt hit Julian. How had he never noticed? Why had he never bothered to ask? "Why didn't you say anything?" Leonardo shrugged. Before he could answer, Isabella stepped in because he had no one to practice with. Julian shifted his gaze to her. "And what do you know about dancing?" For the first time, he saw hesitation cross her face, a brief flicker of doubt, as if she didn't want to answer. Finally, she exhaled. "I know enough." Julian clenched his jaw. There was something off about this woman, something that didn't fit the image of a simple cook. "It's not your job to teach my son." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "It's not. Then why do you do it?" She folded her arms. "Because he asked me to." Julian turned to Leonardo. "Is that true?" The boy nodded silently. The millionaire let out a frustrated breath. He didn't know why, but this was bothering him more than it should have. Something about the way the cook carried herself. Something about the way his son looked at her. Funnily, he fixed his eyes on Isabella and said firmly, "I want to talk to you, alone." She didn't blink. "Whenever you'd like, sir." Julian turned back toward the house, but before stepping inside, he glanced over his shoulder. And then he saw something that made his stomach twist. Isabella leaned in close to Leonardo, whispered something in his ear. The boy's face lit up with a knowing smile, as if they shared a secret, as if she understood something that he didn't. Julian froze. His gut told him there was more to this story, a lot more, and he was determined to find out. Back in his office, Julian ran a hand over his face. Something didn't add up. Isabella wasn't just a cook. His son wasn't simply learning to dance, and there was a connection between them that he couldn't quite grasp. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. When it came to his son, he wouldn't let anyone else take his place. That night, Julian took his usual seat at the dinner table. The long, dark wood gleamed under the glow of the grand chandelier. Silverware was set in perfect order, and the rich aroma of freshly made food filled the air. Everything was exactly as it had always been, except for one thing. Leonardo wasn't staring blankly at his plate. He wasn't pushing his food around absent-mindedly. He didn't look bored. He was restless. His eyes sparkled, filled with anticipation, like he was waiting for dinner to be over as soon as possible. Julian noticed right away. "What's the rush?" he asked, taking a bite. Leonardo's head shot up. "I'm not in a hurry." But it was obvious. The boy couldn't sit still. Every few seconds his eyes darted toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. Julian didn't miss a single movement. He knew exactly who Leonardo was waiting for, and he didn't like it. "You planning on practicing after dinner?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Leonardo hesitated, caught off guard. "Yeah, if you don't mind." Julian set his fork down. "Since when have you been into dancing?" The boy looked away. "For a while now." "Why didn't you ever bring it up?" Leonardo gave a small shrug. "Didn't think you'd care." Julian's expression hardened. "Of course I care." Leonardo met his father's eyes. "Do you, though?" The question hit harder than Julian expected. For a moment, he had no answer. Because the truth was, he had no idea what really mattered to his son. He had never bothered to ask. Julian retreated to his office, shutting the door behind him. His mind was racing. Leonardo had never shown this kind of excitement for anything before, especially something as unexpected as dancing. But what really got under his skin wasn't the dancing itself, it was who he was dancing with. The cook. What did she have that he didn't? How had she managed to earn Leonardo's trust so quickly? Why did his son seem more open with a complete stranger than with his own father? Julian clenched his jaw. Something was off about this. He couldn't ignore it. He sat down at his computer. If the cook was hiding something, he was going to find out. Pulling up the staff records, he typed in her name, Isabel Ruiz, 29 years old. Hired 6 months ago, no criminal history, no red flags. Nothing out of the ordinary, almost too normal. And he didn't like that, so he dug deeper. He typed her name into a search engine, adding a key word, Isabel Ruiz, dancer. The first few results came up empty, but then he found it. An article from 7 years ago. Young ballet prodigy vanishes from the stage without explanation. Julian leaned in, clicking the link. His eyes scanned the screen, absorbing the story, and what he read made his stomach drop. The article described a rising star in the ballet world, a dancer with undeniable talent, praised on every stage she stepped onto, a performer with a promising future, and then, one day she disappeared. No scandals, no injuries, she simply walked away. And no one knew why. Julian sat back, staring at the screen. Now he had even more questions. Why would a dancer with that kind of talent end up working as a cook in his house? What had made her give it all up? And more importantly, why was she so invested in his son? Julian pushed his chair back and stood up. He was done speculating. He was going to get answers. She was a woman with undeniable talent. A dancer who had captivated audiences on every stage, someone with a bright future in the world of dance. Then, one day, she vanished. No scandals, no accidents. She simply walked away, and no one ever knew why. Julian sat in silence, his mind racing with even more questions than before. Why would a dancer with such incredible skill end up working as a cook in his house? What had made her leave everything behind? And most importantly, why was she so invested in his son? Suddenly, he stood up. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He needed answers. Leaving his office, he strode down to the kitchen. He found her tidying up, putting away utensils. When she saw him enter, she didn't look surprised, almost as if she had been expecting him. Mr. Lombardi, Julian shut the door behind him. We need to talk. Isabella dried her hands with a towel. I assume this is about your son. Julian didn't waste any time. You're not just a cook. For the first time, something flickered in her expression, something that looked a lot like guilt. What are you implying? She asked carefully. Julian placed his phone on the table. On the screen was an old news article about her sudden disappearance from the ballet world. Isabella didn't move. She didn't say a word, but her eyes said everything. She knew the truth was out. Julian folded his arms. You're going to tell me everything. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, her expression had changed. You have no idea what you're asking, Mr. Lombardi. Julian stepped closer. Then make me understand. She let out a slow breath. If I tell you the truth, everything will change. Julian didn't flinch. Then tell me. She held his gaze for a long moment before finally opening her mouth to speak. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Julian didn't take his eyes off her. Isabella's hands remained pressed against the table, her focus locked on the phone screen. The image showed a younger version of herself, standing on a grand stage, dressed in an elegant white ballet costume, smiling. Julian knew he couldn't run from this anymore. Why did you give it all up? His voice was steady but low. Isabella shut her eyes briefly. It's not as simple as you think, Mr. Lombardi. Julian crossed his arms. Then make it simple. Isabella let out a quiet sigh. Why did I lose everything? For the first time, Isabella let her guard down. A flicker of sorrow crossed her eyes. When I was 22, my entire world revolved around dance. It was all I had, all I knew. She hesitated, as if saying the words out loud made them harder to bear. I was engaged. His name was Andres. He was a dancer too. We thought we were the perfect pair. Julian noticed her hands tightening against the table. We had been selected for an international tour, an opportunity most dancers could only dream of. She went quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting, lost in a memory she could never escape. But the day before our most important performance, he had an accident. Julian's brow furrowed. What kind of accident? Isabella pressed her lips together. He was hit by a car, killed instantly. Julian didn't know how to respond. The pain in her voice was undeniable. Isabella let out a bitter laugh. Everything changed after that. I couldn't dance without him. I couldn't hear music without feeling the emptiness it left behind. Her eyes glistened, but she refused to let the tears fall. I walked away from the stage, left everything behind. Julian took a deep breath. For the first time, he saw her as more than just a cook. She was someone who had been forced to rebuild her life from nothing. So why now? He asked. Isabella blinked, caught off guard. Why teach my son? She hesitated before answering. Because he reminds me of myself at that age. Julian stiffened. What do you mean? She met his gaze directly. He doesn't smile, Mr. Lombardi. A sharp pang hit Julian's chest. Yes, he does. She shook her head. Not like he does when he dances. Julian clenched his jaw. You think I don't know what my son needs? She didn't back down. I think he needed someone to listen to him. The silence in the room grew thick. Why? Deep down, Julian already knew the answer. He ran a hand through his hair. And what's your goal here? To make him dance like that's going to fix everything? Isabella sighed. It's not just about dance. It was about giving him something that made him feel alive again. Julian stared at the table, his thoughts tangled in confusion. He had always believed he was providing his son with everything he could ever need. A sprawling house, a top-tier education, luxuries that most kids could only dream of. But he had never once stopped to ask what his son actually wanted. And now, a stranger, just a cook, seemed to understand him better than he did. When Julian returned to his bedroom, he found Leonardo still awake, sitting on his bed, gazing out the window. Isn't it late to still be up? His father asked, leaning against the doorframe. Leonardo didn't turn to face him. Are you going to fire her? Julian frowned. Why would you think that? The boy shrugged. You always get upset when someone tries to interfere in my life. The comment stung more than Julian expected. He hesitated before slowly sitting at the edge of the bed. "Do you like dancing?" Leonardo nodded. Julian let out a slow breath. "You never told me." "You never asked," Leonardo replied simply. Julian fell silent, because his son was right. That night, sleep evaded Julian. He lay staring at the ceiling, his mind racing, thinking about Isabella, about Leonardo, about what all of this meant, and about the possibility that for the first time in years, he was the one who had it all wrong. The next morning he made up his mind. He headed downstairs earlier than usual. Isabella was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she noticed him enter. She stopped, waiting for him to speak. And then Julian said something she never expected. "I don't want you to stop teaching him." Isabella blinked, surprised. "Excuse me? My son has never been this happy, and if dancing makes him happy, then I want him to keep going." For the first time, Isabella smiled. And in that moment, Julian realized this was only the beginning. The morning unfolded like any other. Julian walked into the kitchen early, expecting to see Isabella serving breakfast as usual. But today, something had changed. The kitchen was no longer just a place where meals were made. It had become a sanctuary, a space where his son could smile, where he had found something that had been missing from his life all this time. And the hardest part was that it wasn't because of him. It was because of her. Julian clenched his jaw. Accepting his decision to let Isabella continue teaching Leonardo to dance hadn't been easy, and now, as he watched her laugh softly with his son, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping in. Like she was stepping into a role that should have been his. Like his son was forming a bond with her that he had never been able to build himself. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Lombardi?" Isabella's voice was calm, just as it always was. Julian stiffened for a second. "No, thank you." She nodded and went back to preparing breakfast. Leonardo, sitting at the table, ate with enthusiasm. Not the usual indifference, not with the blank, distracted expression he always wore. He was excited, because after breakfast, he had another lesson with her. Julian took a sip of water, trying to ignore the discomfort twisting in his chest. "What time are you starting today?" he asked. Leonardo looked up. 4 o'clock. Julian crossed his arms. "Don't forget about your studies." I know, Leonardo answered quickly, barely paying attention. That was unusual. Julian had never needed to remind his son about anything. Leonardo was always structured, responsible, disciplined. But now, he seemed in a rush to get through the day, eager to step outside, to dance, to be with her. And that unsettled Julian more than he wanted to admit. He retreated to his office, but his mind stayed in the kitchen. He couldn't focus. He couldn't ignore how his son had changed lately. And most of all, he couldn't ignore what Isabella now represented in his home. He decided to go for a walk to clear his head. As he wandered through the hallways, he muttered to himself. Outside in the backyard, Isabella was taking a break. For a moment, Julian hesitated. He could have just walked past. He could have ignored her. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped out onto the patio and slowly approached her. She noticed his presence but didn't flinch. "Mr. Lombardi." Julian folded his arms. "Do you have a moment?" She studied him carefully. "Of course." Julian sat down on the stone bench across from her. The sun bathed the grass in warm light, and the morning breeze rustled the leaves in the trees. But inside, Julian felt anything but calm. Deep down, Julian felt anything but at ease. "Why does my son trust you so much?" he asked, his voice tinged with something between curiosity and frustration. Isabella seemed caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" Julian crossed his arms. "Since my wife passed away, Leonardo has never really opened up to anyone. Not his tutors, not his therapist, not even me." Isabella lowered her gaze. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger." Julian let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Aren't you a stranger to him?" She lifted her eyes. "No, but I'm not his father either." The words hit Julian like a punch to the gut. Why did they feel so true? No matter how hard he tried, Leonardo had found in her something he had never found in him. Julian took a deep breath. I don't want you to think I don't appreciate what you've done for him, he said carefully. Isabella studied him. But? Julian's jaw tightened. But I don't want you to take him away from me. For a moment, Isabella hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Lombardi, I can't take him away from you. Julian stiffened. What do you mean? Her expression was calm but firm. If Leonardo is distant, it's not because of me. The words landed harder than he expected, because he knew they were true. Julian looked down at the floor. He had always been so sure of himself, but now he wasn't. He wanted to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Isabella broke the silence, her voice gentle. Leonardo looks up to you. Julian lifted his head quickly. You really think so? She gave a small smile. Yes, but he's afraid. Julian felt his chest tighten. Afraid of what? Of letting you down. The weight of those words settled heavily on Julian. He had always assumed his son saw him as distant, maybe even cold, but he had never considered that Leonardo might be afraid of disappointing him. And that changed everything. Later that evening, Julian found Leonardo in his room. The boy was sitting on the floor, lacing up his dance shoes. Julian paused in the doorway, watching for a moment. He had never been the type of father to talk about feelings, but tonight he was going to try. Son, he said quietly. Leonardo looked up. Yeah? Julian took a slow breath. I just want you to know, if this is really what you love doing, you don't have to hide it from me. Leonardo's eyes widened in surprise. You mean that? Julian nodded. Yes. And I don't ever want you to be afraid of letting me down. Leonardo lowered his head. I just don't want you to think less of me. Julian knelt in front of him. Leonardo, you are my son, and I am proud of you, no matter what. For the first time in a long time, emotion flickered across Leonardo's face. He felt seen, and for the first time in a long time, Julian felt like he was finally getting something right as a father. The morning sunlight crept through the towering windows of the Lombardi estate, casting a golden glow across the grand halls. In the kitchen, the clinking of silverware, plates, and the steady stream of coffee filling a mug marked the start of what should have been an ordinary day. But for Julian Lombardi, nothing about today felt ordinary. Something had shifted inside him after his conversation with Leonardo the night before. For the first time in years, he had let himself truly be a father, and for the first time in years, his son had looked at him with trust. Julian still wasn't sure how to navigate all of it, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let the distance between them grow again. That was why today he was going to do something different. He was going to watch his son dance. From his office, he could hear the faint sound of music drifting in from the backyard. He rose from his chair, a strange feeling tugging at him. Curiosity, anticipation, maybe even pride. Walking quietly down the long hall, he made his way to the glass doors leading to the garden. Just before stepping outside, he hesitated, watching through the glass, and what he saw left him speechless. Leonardo moved with a grace Julian had never seen before. His steps were light but confident, precise yet effortless. He was no longer the hesitant boy Julian had known. For the first time, he wasn't just watching his son, he was seeing him. Every movement was precise, filled with dedication and passion. He wasn't the same awkward, reserved kid from just days ago. This was his son, a boy who had finally discovered something that truly brought him joy. And standing there in the midst of it all was Isabella. Watching, guiding, patiently correcting each step, Julian clenched his fists. Not out of anger, but because he couldn't deny the truth any longer. She had changed his son's life, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, he owed her for that. Julian waited until the rehearsal wrapped up. When he saw Leonardo heading off to change, he decided now was the time. He walked toward Isabella, who was gathering her things. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face calm, unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting him. Mr. Lombardi, she greeted him smoothly. Julian folded his arms across his chest. I want to thank you. Isabella arched an eyebrow slightly. For what? He let out a slow breath. For what you've done for my son. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. I didn't do anything special. I just listened. Julian glanced away, jaw tightening. That's more than I've done in years. The air between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken words. After a pause, Isabella finally spoke. If you don't mind me asking, why is it so hard for you to see him happy? Julian stiffened. What are you implying? She met his gaze without hesitation, that every time he finds something that brings him joy, you seem to look for a reason why it's wrong. Julian pressed his lips together. She wasn't wrong, but he wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. Julian walked back to his office, his mind spinning. Why was this so difficult for him to accept? Why did it feel like he was losing something? And then it hit him. It wasn't that Isabella was taking his son away. It was that Leonardo had found in her something he had never been able to provide, a source of support, someone who understood him. And that was what hurt the most, because it made him see all the mistakes he had made, all the time he had wasted, and now he wasn't sure if he still had a chance to fix it. Julian forced himself to leave his office when Leonardo's dance lessons started again, but this time he didn't watch from a distance. This time he stepped closer. He walked out into the garden and sat on a stone bench where he could see everything clearly. Leonardo noticed him and hesitated for a second. His father had never watched him dance up close before, and that made him nervous. Julian caught on right away, so he did something he had never done before. He smiled, and he nodded, a silent message that he was still there, a sign that this time he wasn't going to judge. Leonardo took a deep breath and continued dancing, and as he moved, Julian felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he felt proud of his son, not because of what he was doing, not because of how talented he was, but because he had the courage to follow his passion no matter what. And that was something Julian had never seen in him before. Later that evening, Julian was sitting in the reading room when Leonardo walked in. The boy looked nervous. Julian closed the book in his hands. Something on your mind? Leonardo hesitated for a moment, then he spoke. Dad, would you let me compete? Julian blinked. Compete? Leonardo nodded. In a dance competition. Julian's heart pounded a little harder, not because he was against it, but because this wasn't just a hobby anymore. This was real. Leonardo was ready to take his love for dance to the next level, and now the real question was Julian ready to accept that? Julian didn't answer right away. He sat in silence, letting his son's words settle. Compete, he repeated, in a dance tournament? Leonardo waited anxiously, his eyes filled with excitement, but also a flicker of doubt. He knew his father could say no. That, with just one word, he could shut this down, turn his dream into nothing more than a fleeting whim. But Julian didn't rush his response. He exhaled deeply and closed his eyes for a moment. He had known this moment would come. He had known that if he let Leonardo keep dancing, at some point he would want more, and now that moment was here. Finally, Julian opened his eyes and spoke. Tell me more about the competition. Leonardo's eyes widened in surprise. Does that mean yes? Julian crossed his arms. It means I want to understand. Leonardo held his breath for a second. Then, a bright smile broke across his face as he launched into an explanation. Julian knew he couldn't make this decision alone, so, after talking with Leonardo, he went to find Isabella. He found her in the kitchen, putting away ingredients after dinner. When she saw him walk in, she didn't look surprised. I knew you'd come looking for me, she said calmly. Julian raised an eyebrow. And why is that? Because I know what your son asked you. And why is that? Julian leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms. Because I know what your son asked of you. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. And what do you think about that? Isabella let out a quiet sigh. I think it's his dream, and crushing that would be a mistake. Julian studied her expression, his gaze unwavering. But what if he fails? Isabella met his eyes with a calm certainty. And what if he doesn't? Silence thickened the air between them. Julian knew she had a point, but there was still something gnawing at him. Why do you care so much? His voice was softer this time, tinged with curiosity. Isabella hesitated for a brief moment before speaking in a quieter tone. Because when I was his age, I had the same dream, but no one believed in me. Julian felt a subtle tension settle over him. Your family didn't support you? She gave a small, wistful smile. They told me it wasn't a real career, that it was just a hobby, that I shouldn't waste my time on something so unstable. She looked away for a second, her voice steady but touched with sadness. So they made me give it up. Julian remained motionless. For the first time, he understood why Isabella was so adamant about Leonardo's passion. It wasn't just about recognizing his talent. It was about seeing a reflection of herself in him. Julian sat in his dimly lit study, his mind racing. He needed to make a decision. He couldn't just let his son step into this competition without considering the consequences. He knew how unforgiving the real world could be. He had seen dreams crushed before, and more than anything, he knew what failure felt like. Because he had failed many times. He had failed in his marriage, he had failed as a husband, and up until now he feared he had failed as a father too. If Leonardo competed, if he encouraged him to chase this dream, and if he failed, could Julian bear to watch his son go through that disappointment? He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. There was only one person who could help him decide, someone he had never truly discussed this with, but who was still present in his life. His wife. Julian got up and walked into his bedroom. Opening the drawer of his desk, he reached beneath old papers and pulled out a small box. Inside was a photograph. His wife, beaming, holding Leonardo as a baby. He sat on the bed, staring at the picture in silence. I don't know what to do, he whispered. The weight of her absence filled the room. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what she would say. If you were here, what would you tell me? The answer came instantly, not in words, but in a memory, one he had long forgotten. 7 years ago. You can't shield him from everything, Julian. Why not? He's my son. Because he has to learn to stand on his own. Julian had frowned back then, watching as their toddler son took his first wobbly steps. What if he falls? His wife had given him a knowing smile. Then we'll be here to pick him up. The memory hit him like a bolt of lightning. He finally understood. It wasn't about shielding Leonardo from failure. It was about letting him try, letting him stumble, letting him learn. And if he fell, Julian would be there to catch him. Without hesitation, he got up and went to find his son. Leonardo was sitting on his bed, his phone clutched in his hands, his expression tense as if waiting for an answer that might not come. Julian leaned against the doorframe. Son? Leonardo looked up quickly. Yeah? Julian took a deep breath, then said the words his son never expected to hear. Go for it. Julian nodded. If this is what you truly want, then yes, do it. For a moment, Leonardo sat frozen in disbelief. Then, without warning, he jumped up and threw his arms around his father. Julian stiffened at first, surprised, but then he slowly wrapped his arms around his son. He couldn't remember the last time Leonardo had hugged him like that, and in that moment, he knew he had made the right decision. Why not? He's my son, because he needs to learn to fall on his own. Julian watched his wife, who smiled as she watched Leonardo take his first wobbly steps. If we don't let him try, he'll never learn to walk. Julian frowned. And what if he gets hurt? She looked at him with warmth in her eyes. Then we'll be there to help him back up. The memory struck Julian like a bolt of lightning. In that instant, he knew what he had to do. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about letting his son try, letting him take his own steps. And if he fell, Julian would be there to pick him up. Julian found Leonardo in his room, sitting on his bed with his phone in hand, looking nervous, as if waiting for an answer that hadn't arrived yet. Julian leaned against the doorframe. Son? Leonardo looked up quickly. Yeah? Julian took a deep breath, and then he said the words his son never expected to hear. Go for it. Leonardo blinked. Seriously? Julian nodded. Yes. If this is what you really want, then do it. For a moment, Leonardo was speechless. Then, unable to hold back, he jumped up and wrapped his arms around his father. Julian froze. He couldn't remember the last time his son had hugged him like that, and in that moment, he knew he had made the right decision. Later that night, Julian went downstairs to the kitchen. Isabella was putting away dishes when she saw him enter. Mr. Lombardi? Julian stopped at the doorway and met her gaze. "Let's get him ready for the competition." Isabella blinked, surprised, and then, for the first time in a long time, she smiled. Genuinely smiled. Because she knew this wasn't just about Leonardo. This was a chance for Julian to become the father he had always wanted to be. The alarm went off early that morning, earlier than usual. Julian rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling. He knew today was going to be different. Today, his son was starting his training for the competition. And this time, he wouldn't just watch from afar. This time, he would be present. Julian got out of bed and pulled on comfortable clothes. Something in him had shifted. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing his son. He felt like maybe he was finally getting to know him. When he came downstairs, the sound of laughter caught him off guard. The kitchen, once a place of routine and formality, felt like something else entirely. Leonardo sat at the counter devouring breakfast with excitement. Isabella stood beside him scrolling through something on her phone. "Ready to train?" she asked. Leonardo nodded eagerly. "More than ready." Julian walked over to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup. "What time do you start?" Leonardo looked up, surprised. "You want to watch?" Julian took a sip of coffee. "I'll be there for every session." Isabella lifted her head, studying him. "That means you're in this with us." Julian exhaled slowly. "It means I'm not sitting on the sidelines anymore." Leonardo grinned with excitement. Isabella, on the other hand, seemed to analyze his words carefully, as if trying to gauge just how much the millionaire had really changed. Training began in the mansion's ballroom, a vast room lined with mirrors, its polished wooden floor gleaming under the soft lighting, one of many extravagant features. Julian had built into his home, yet rarely used. Today, for the first time, it had a real purpose. Leonardo stood in front of the mirrors, stretching his arms. Isabella stepped beside him. "We'll start with endurance." Leonardo nodded with determination. Julian remained silent, watching. For the first time, he saw his son completely in his element, Frost, motivated, happy. And he couldn't help but compare. When he had taken him to piano lessons years ago, Leonardo had never shown this kind of energy. He had never looked this alive. Julian crossed his arms, and for the first time he realized the truth. He had spent years trying to mold his son into something he wasn't, and now he finally saw him for who he truly was. For years, Julian had tried to shape his son into someone he wasn't, but now, for the first time, he saw the truth with absolute clarity. His only job wasn't to mold him, it was to stand by him. Training intensified. Leonardo pushed through spins, jumps, and precise postures, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. Mistakes happened, stumbles were inevitable, frustration set in. At one point, Leonardo attempted a particularly tricky spin, lost his balance, and crashed hard onto the floor. Julian instinctively moved toward him, but Isabella stepped in first. "Don't help him," she murmured. Julian's brows furrowed. "Why not? He needs to get up on his own." Julian hesitated. Leonardo remained on the floor, catching his breath. His hands trembled, his chest rose and fell rapidly. Then, with effort, he pushed himself up. Determination burned in his eyes. "I'll do it again," he said. And at that moment, Julian realized something crucial. His son was stronger than he had ever given him credit for. He didn't need protecting, he needed support. An hour later, Isabella called for a break. Leonardo collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but grinning. Julian walked over and handed him a bottle of water. "Good work, son." Leonardo took it with a tired but satisfied smile. "Thanks, Dad." Isabella watched them, a faint smile crossing her lips. Julian caught it. "What?" She shook her head. "Nothing, just, it's nice to see you finally seeing him." Julian stood silent for a beat. Deep down, he knew she was right. Behind, he had only looked at his son. Now, for the first time, he truly saw him, and for the first time, he felt proud, not because of what Leonardo did, but because of who he was. After training, Julian retreated to his office, supposedly to get some work done. But his mind wasn't on contracts or investments, it was in the dance studio, on his son, on his progress, and on one question he couldn't shake. Was he ready to let him compete? He knew Leonardo had talent, that much was obvious. But he also knew the world wasn't always kind. At some point his son would face rejection, and Julian's biggest fear wasn't that he'd fail, it was that he wouldn't know how to handle it. Later that day, Julian sought out Isabella. He found her in the kitchen, prepping ingredients. "I need to ask you something," he said. She glanced up, intrigued. "Go ahead." Julian folded his arms. "What happens if Leonardo doesn't win? How do you think he'll handle it?" Isabella studied him for a moment. "Are you afraid he's not strong enough to take it?" Julian exhaled slowly and nodded. "I don't want him to be so disappointed that he gives up entirely." Isabella placed her hands on the counter and let out a soft sigh. "Mr. Lombardi," she said, meeting his eyes, "Leonardo has already endured the greatest loss of his life." Julian's chest tightened. She continued, "Losing a competition doesn't even compare to losing his mother." Julian closed his eyes briefly. He couldn't argue with that. His son had already survived the worst kind of pain. Maybe, just maybe, he was stronger than Julian had ever realized. That evening, Leonardo sat with his father in the living room. Julian studied him carefully. "How do you feel about training?" he asked. Leonardo stretched his arms, exhaustion evident in his posture, but his eyes were still bright. "Tired," he admitted, "but happy." Julian let out a slow breath. "Then keep going." Leonardo blinked in surprise. "You really believe in me?" Julian reached over and ruffled his hair. "Always." Leonardo smiled, and for the first time, Julian felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. No matter what happened, his son was going to be okay. The sky was still dark, only a faint glow on the horizon hinting at the approaching dawn. Julian woke up before his alarm, though he hadn't needed it for a while. Something inside him kept him awake, alert. Every passing day brought Leonardo closer to the competition, and no matter how hard Julian tried to remain calm, the anxiety gnawed at him. What if his son wasn't ready? What if he wasn't good enough? But worst of all, what if he lost all the confidence he had built? Julian rubbed his face with both hands. He didn't have the answers, but today, more than ever, he knew one thing for certain. He needed to be there. Right beside him, the ballroom was cold and silent when Julian arrived. Leonardo was already in the center of the room, stretching. His face was set, focused. He wasn't the same boy who used to retreat into the background. He stood like a dancer. Isabella stood beside him, arms crossed. "Today we push harder," she announced. Leonardo didn't hesitate. "Okay." Julian folded his arms. "What exactly does that mean?" Isabella glanced at him briefly. "It means he's working to his limit." Julian clenched his jaw. He didn't like the idea of his son overexerting himself, but he had to let him try. Leonardo had a dream, and for the first time, Julian was committed to supporting it. The training was grueling. Leonardo practiced jumps, spins, movements that required strength, precision, and absolute control. Julian watched in silence. Isabella corrected every step. If it wasn't right, they repeated it, again and again. "Again," Isabella instructed. Leonardo sighed in frustration. "I've done it 5 times, then do it 6, she said without missing a beat. The boy bit his lip, glancing at his father. Julian remained still. He knew Leonardo was waiting for him to step in, to call it quits for the day, to say it was enough, but he didn't. Because he knew his son could handle this, and if he wanted to go far, he had to learn to push through. Leonardo exhaled sharply, and then he tried again. The training was getting more intense. Every time Leonardo made a mistake, frustration was written all over his face. And then it happened. A misstep, a stumble. Leonardo hit the ground hard. "Leonardo!" Julian immediately stood up, but before he could take a step forward, Isabella raised a hand to stop him. "Let him be. He's on the ground, and he needs to learn how to get back up." Leonardo sat there, his brows furrowed. "I can't do it," he murmured. Julian felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but Isabella didn't soften. "Get up," she said firmly. Leonardo shook his head. "I can't." "Yes, you can," she insisted, "but if you choose to stay down, the competition will crush you." Leonardo clenched his fists. Julian watched the scene unfold. He wanted to step in, tell his son he could take a break, that he didn't have to push himself so hard if he was exhausted. But then something unexpected happened. Leonardo shut his eyes, took a deep breath, and stood up. On his own. His determination outweighed his fatigue, and in that moment Julian understood something important. His son wasn't a little boy anymore, he was a fighter. After practice, Julian approached Isabella. "Don't you think you were too hard on him?" he asked. She met his gaze calmly. "I didn't push him any harder than he could handle." Julian exhaled in frustration. "But what if he gets hurt?" "If he gets hurt," she said, her voice steady, "he'll learn from it." Julian studied her for a long moment. "You're tough on him?" Isabella let out a wry smile. "Because I respect him, and I respect his dream," Julian frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't treat him like a fragile kid who needs saving." Julian went silent. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent his whole life trying to protect Leonardo, but now he realized that sometimes the greatest act of love was letting him fight his own battles. That afternoon, Leonardo got a message on his phone. As he read it, his expression shifted. Julian, who was sitting beside him, noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" Leonardo hesitated before finally looking up. "One of the other dancers says I don't stand a chance." Julian's jaw tightened. "Who?" Leonardo turned his phone toward him. On the screen was a boy about his age with an arrogant smirk in his profile picture. "His name's Santiago," Leonardo muttered. "He's won the last 2 years in a row." Julian narrowed his eyes. He knew how this worked. When people saw a threat, they tried to shake them up before the competition. But his son couldn't fall for it. "You know what I think?" Julian said. Leonardo shook his head. Julian smirked slightly. "If he's trying to rattle you, it's because he knows you can beat him." Leonardo's eyes lit up. And at that moment, Julian knew he had just done something important. He had given his son confidence. That night, as he sat alone in his room, Julian thought about everything that had happened about Leonardo, about how much he had grown, about the fact that, without realizing it, Julian himself was changing too. He looked out the window, watching the moon cast its glow over the garden, and for the first time he felt that everything was right where it was supposed to be. Leonardo was ready. Now, the real question was he? The sun had barely begun to rise when Julian's alarm blared. He got out of bed faster than usual, adrenaline coursing through him. Today was the day his son would dance in his first competition. As he buttoned a dark dress shirt and pulled on a pair of slacks, his mind kept racing. He thought about Leonardo, about his progress, about how he had gone from a shy, uncertain boy to a disciplined, determined dancer. But more than anything, he thought about fear, his son's fear of failing, his own fear of watching him fall. Julian met his own reflection in the mirror and took a deep breath. Today wasn't about him. Today was about Leonardo, and he would do whatever it took to stand by his side. When he stepped into the kitchen, he found Leonardo already dressed in his competition outfit. Sleek black pants, a fitted white tank top, and his hair neatly styled. His son looked different, older, stronger. But when Julian looked closer, he saw it. Beneath the confidence, beneath the composure, there was nervousness. "How do you feel?" Julian asked. Pouring himself a cup of coffee, Leonardo hesitated. "I don't know." Julian raised an eyebrow. "You don't know?" The boy tapped his fingers on the table. "I know I've trained hard, but what if I freeze on stage?" Julian stepped closer, placing both hands on the table. "That's not going to happen." Leonardo glanced up. "How do you know?" Julian offered a small smile. "Because fear only lasts a second. If you face it, it disappears." Leonardo frowned slightly. "And what if it doesn't?" Julian shrugged. "Then you dance through the fear." "But you dance." A small, nervous smile crossed Leonardo's face. "Have you ever done something even though you were scared?" he asked. Julian went quiet for a moment, thinking about his life, about the risks he had taken in business, not knowing if they would pay off, about being a father without ever truly knowing what he was doing. "Every day," he finally admitted. Leonardo stared at him, and in that moment he understood something important. Fear never truly goes away. You just learn to live with it. His son looked different, more mature, stronger. But when Julian looked closer, he noticed the nervous flicker in his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Leonardo hesitated. "I'm not sure." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Not sure?" The boy fidgeted with his fingers on the table. "I've trained a lot, but what if I freeze on stage?" Julian stepped closer, resting his hands on the table. "That won't happen." Leonardo looked up. "How do you know?" Julian gave a slight smile. "Because fear only lasts a second. If you face it, it disappears." Leonardo frowned, deep in thought. "And if it doesn't go away?" Julian shrugged. "Then you dance with fear, but you dance." The boy gave a faint smile. "Have you ever done something while scared?" Julian fell silent. He thought about his life, the tough decisions, the business risks he took without knowing if they'd pay off, and most of all, being a father when he had no idea what he was doing. "Every single day," he finally answered. Leonardo studied his father carefully, and in that moment he realized something important. Fear never truly goes away. We just learn to live with it. The drive to the theater felt endless. Leonardo sat in the back seat, headphones in. Isabella rode shotgun, reviewing event details on her phone. And Julian? He just drove in silence. The city traffic seemed more chaotic than usual, or maybe it was just his nerves making everything feel tenser. He glanced in the rear-view mirror. Leonardo closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He was tense, but not once did he ask to turn back. He never said he couldn't do it, and that more than anything made Julian proud. When they arrived at the theater, the place was packed. Dancers of all ages filled the hallways. Some were practicing their moves, others were doing breathing exercises, some just paced nervously. Leonardo stood at the entrance, taking it all in. "This is real," he whispered. Julian clapped him on the back. "It was always real, son." Leonardo nodded slowly. Isabella handed him a water bottle. "You have 30 minutes before you're up." Leonardo took a sip. "I can warm up here?" Isabella nodded. "Of course, just focus on yourself." Leonardo stepped away to stretch. But then a voice cut through the moment. "Didn't know they let beginners compete here." Julian immediately looked up. Standing in front of Leonardo was a boy with an arrogant smirk. Santiago. The same kid who sent the taunting message days ago. Leonardo clenched his jaw. "I'm not a beginner," Santiago snickered. "Oh yeah? How many competitions have you won?" Leonardo didn't answer. Julian stepped forward, but Isabella placed a hand on his arm. "Let him handle this." Julian tensed. "But he needs to handle it on his own." Julian looked at his son, and he saw him clenching his fists, but not losing control. Leonardo took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "None so far," Santiago scoffed. "Then you don't stand a chance." Leonardo met his gaze. "You know what I think?" Santiago raised an eyebrow. "What?" Leonardo smirked. "If you were really that good, you wouldn't waste your time talking to me." Santiago's face shifted. For the first time, he was at a loss for words. Julian felt a surge of pride. His son didn't need anyone to defend him. He stood up for himself, and that was worth more than any trophy. The judges took their seats. The audience filled the auditorium. Backstage, Leonardo's heart pounded in his chest. Julian walked over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens out there, I'm proud of you." Leonardo looked up, surprised. "Even if I lose?" Julian smiled. "Especially if you lose, because you had the courage to try." Leonardo's eyes welled up with emotion. For the first time, his father really saw him. "Thanks, Dad." Julian nodded. And then the announcer's voice rang out over the speakers. "Let's welcome Leonardo Lombardi." The stage lights flared on. The curtain parted, and Leonardo took his first step toward his destiny. The theater fell silent. Only the soft murmur of the audience and the creak of the stage under Leonardo's feet could be heard. He stood center stage, back straight, his heartbeat echoing in his chest. The lights beamed down, making him feel exposed, vulnerable. In the front row, Julian watched with arms crossed, his face unreadable but his eyes gleaming with pride. Isabella stood beside him, holding her breath, and in the back, Santiago watched, smirking. But Leonardo wasn't going to let him get in his head. The announcer gave the signal, "You may begin when ready." Leonardo closed his eyes, took a breath, and then the music started. The sound of the piano filled the theater, marking the start of his performance. Leonardo lifted his arms, letting the music lead him. He knew everything depended on this moment. He had trained for weeks. He had fallen, he had gotten back up, and now it was time to prove himself. The first step was smooth, controlled, a graceful turn, a perfect leap. But then, fear gripped him. For a split second, everything blurred. The lights, the audience, the music. His breathing grew uneven, his mind filled with doubts. What if he messed up? What if they saw him fall? What if he disappointed his father? Panic threatened to take over. He felt his pulse quicken, his muscles tense. He had been here before, standing at the edge of fear, on the brink of failure, but he couldn't let it win. He closed his eyes for half a second, grounding himself in the rhythm of the piano. The melody was steady, unwavering. He took a deep breath, then he moved. His body responded instinctively, muscle memory taking over. A spin, a jump, a landing as light as air. The fear was still there, but he danced through it, embracing the uncertainty. The crowd watched in silence, captivated. With each passing note, his confidence grew. His movements became bolder, stronger. By the final crescendo, he was soaring, lost in the music, no longer afraid. And when he landed the last step, the theater erupted in applause. And then he looked at the front row. There, amidst the sea of faces, was his father. The bright overhead lights cast a warm glow on his familiar features, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Leonardo had prepared for this moment for months. Endless hours of practice, countless nights spent worrying about whether he was good enough. But as he met his father's gaze, everything else faded. Julian didn't watch with worry or fear. He didn't hold his breath or clench his fists like the other spectators. Instead, his eyes shone with something Leonardo had never seen before. Pride. Pure and unwavering. It wasn't the kind of pride that depended on victory, nor the kind that came from accomplishments alone. It was deeper than that. It told Leonardo that no matter what happened next, whether he triumphed or stumbled, his father was already proud of him. Leonardo inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his doubts lift from his chest. The tension in his shoulders eased, his pulse steadied. And in that moment, the fear vanished. He was ready.